Welcome everyone to this AGF webinar. Today is Velo-City 2023, Bringing Lessons to Australia. First, the Amy Gillett Foundation respectfully acknowledges the traditional owners and custodians of the land from which we will be presenting today. The Gadigal people from the Eora Nation and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Foundation acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal land and Torres Strait Islander people today. A little bit of housekeeping. Please keep your microphone and, if you wish, your camera off during the presentations. As I said before, if you have your lunch or something to eat, please feel free to do it with the camera off. We will have a chat icon, as you may all already be familiar with, to collect your questions. And at the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A section. When you please feel free to raise your hand if you want to make a question to one of the presenters. Antonia will be helping us with that. And now Velo-City. Let's start with what is the Velo-City conference. It's already been 40 years of this conference. It didn't take place yearly at the beginning, but every 2 or 5 years. But it's already been 40 years. It's mainly European, but in some occasions, it has also taken place outside Europe. As you can see, in 2014, it was hosted by Adelaide here in Australia. And it is one of those conferences where you can expect practical activities, theory, and then a little bit more. There are parallel sessions, there are plenaries, there are bike rides, there are very hands-on workshops as well. And there's always a dinner and social events that will allow you to connect with people who are there, eager to learn, and willing to share their experiences from projects from around the world. And the beauty of Velo-City is that not only the success and the wins are shared, but also the struggle, what went wrong, and even how some cities are making changes to make things better after experiencing some kind of disappointment in a project or a policy. So it's a very good opportunity to learn and learn from the best. Not sure what's not working. Yes. Now we will hear from our presenters today. We will hear from Sara, Rob, Robbie, and Stuart. And we will start today with Sara. Sara Stace is a city shaper, strategic thinker, and innovator with extensive knowledge about cities, land use, and urban transport. She has worked at federal, state, and local government and private sector for over 25 years. Has written and co-authored 20 publications for the Australian government and the United Nations, among others. And Sara is currently WSP's Director of Cities. Let's welcome Sara.
Hi, everyone. Great to see all these names on the call. And yeah, we had an awesome time at Velo-City in Leipzig in Germany. I think there were about 20 Australians in all, which was a lot of fun. So I'm going to talk about this phrase that came up in the closing plenary, which I'll give a bit more explanation to in a moment. Is be realistic, demand the impossible. And I'm showing here an image that I took a couple of days after the conference. I spent about a week afterwards on looking at Copenhagen and different parts of the Netherlands before heading back home. And I love this image because it's in the middle of Copenhagen and there is a street that is just covered in bike lanes. Like they've got the blue cycleway that crosses right across the middle of the signalized intersection there. You've got space for pedestrians. There's just bike lanes everywhere, which for us is completely impossible, but it was real. Next, please. So the images I'm going to show here is a photograph from the Netherlands in Amsterdam. It was a very fancy neighborhood. It was a bit like Wallara here in Sydney or Toorak. It was just lovely, beautiful shops. And here were a couple of teenagers riding past, being very ordinary teenagers in the Netherlands, giving a dink. And I've also discovered why Van Moof has a very strong crossbar. It's so that you can give a lift to your friend. And so the phrase, be realistic, demand the impossible, came up in their closing plenary. And the other things that came out of that was that civil society, and by that we mean things like advocacy organisations, and in my spare time I'm the president of Better Streets and also on the World Cycling Alliance. And that person was saying that civil society, those advocacy organisations, need to say the things that politicians and bureaucrats can't, and to not stand quietly on the sidelines, that we really need to be affecting change through that political process and working with communities. And another phrase that was lovely is, you're on the right side of history. So that really, I thought, was a lovely way to finish off the conference. We'll jump to the next one, into some of the earlier sessions and some of the things that came out of that. So one of them, and you'll hear this a couple of times here, I think, in this presentation today, is that Rodney Ellis, who's a politician in Texas, said, some people get mad, really mad. And he also said some other quite controversial things, like if we'd voted to remove slavery, it would never have been abolished. And he's a Black American, I guess he has the authority to say that, but also said that most people across the globe where we've put in freeways weren't really asked. And they wouldn't have agreed to those freeways if they had been asked. So I thought that was a really interesting take on that kind of risk taking, and the fact that people will get mad. They do, about all sorts of projects, including cycleways. And another point he made is that many people can't drive, but they don't get a say in the process, or they often don't get a say. And so I looked up some statistics here in Australia, and it turns out that 40% of our population in Australia can't drive. They're either too young, they're children, or they're too old, or they've got living with a disability, like this person here in Copenhagen, where he's got the walking cane on the back of his bike. Next. Another phrase that came up a lot throughout the conference is that a good bike plan is a car plan, and that you really need to be managing traffic cars, and you also need to be managing car parking. And Oslo gave an example amongst many, many, many cities, including Ghent and Paris as well, where they said, look, Norway loves electric vehicles. In fact, I think something like 90% of all their new car sales are electric vehicles, but they are going to reduce car traffic by 30% in their city in the next few years, and they're removing parking bays as just one example of that. Thanks, Jen. Philip Kreist was by far my favourite presenter. I've heard him speak before, but he was absolutely on fire at this conference. He works for the International Transport Forum as part of the OECD, and he said we really need to take a new paradigm with a deep-rooted human approach. So I'm going to paraphrase, or sorry, I'm directly phrasing some of the things he said there. One is, cars have appropriated public space and streets, and that space has been taken from our life for the movement of fast vehicles. He said that globally we've collectively embraced that model of car dependence and shackled our suburbs to cars, and that you simply cannot, and this was phrased so many times throughout the conference, you cannot just drop bike infrastructure into a car-centric society. It just isn't enough. And so we really need to take that deep-seated approach towards people, taking cars away from our minds and on our streets, not just from our streets. And he quoted Henry Lefebvre when he said that the right to the city is a human right, and that urban spaces should be accessible for all. And that's why I've shown this photo here from Copenhagen of, I'm presuming it's a husband and wife going out, enjoying the sunshine at Superkillen. And again, it's impossible for us to conceive of that, but it was very real. Next one. And then finally from the conference, Emmanuel John, who's one of my fellow board members on the World Cycling Alliance, who represents the African continent, he said that you can't tell a fish to live on a mountain. And what I think he meant by that is this photograph here is in Amsterdam, and it's of 3 teenage girls riding to play hockey on a Sunday morning, and they look so relaxed. They are not paying attention to the traffic at all. They're just out there riding their bikes, looking at their phones, listening to music. One of them's being dinkied. That would be totally impossible here in Australia, and yet it was real. And so I think that we are the fish, and we can't even see the mountain. We don't know what's up there, but here's the mountain, right? So he sort of said, look, we've copied and pasted from the US and the UK, and it hasn't worked. We really need to, in his words, put a fire in the tail of people to change the whole system, and that people do need to experience that in order to understand where we're going. Now, I know I've got a couple of minutes, so I'm going to jump to some thinking that I was, if you could jump to the next one, Jen. This was some thinking. I had read this blog before going to the conference, and then I spent a lot of time just looking at the streets. I'd studied architecture. I'm a registered architect, and yet this just totally blew my mind as a concept. So it's from a blog. You can just Google it, and his blog is called, I want my, oh, sorry, if you can just go back one. Yep. I want my street to be like this. Now, I've drawn a very bodgy diagram of what you see in the picture there. So it's a plan of the building line. And so he's saying that whereas we conceive of the street from the inside out, where we're looking at, first we look at, 2 ways of moving traffic, then the cars, and then there might be some space for some pedestrians after that. He said the Dutch and Danes think of things from the outside in. So here's the building line, and then we jump to the next photograph. And then they allocate space for pedestrians. In a street that's got faster moving traffic, you would also put in your cycleways. In this instance, a 30k street, so they don't need that. And then next. Then you're allocating your room for your cycling infrastructure. In this case, it's lots of bike parking, and that's sort of scattered throughout the street. And then the next one. Then you put your trees, so you can see in the photograph there, there's trees and vegetation, so that goes in. And then the final one is where you sort of then squeeze in your parking. Amongst those zones, you might put in some electric vehicle charging. And then there's room, then we start to look at how much room is left for the cars to move. And in this case, it's one way for traffic is left. So I just love that conception, and I want to leave that with everyone around that sort of real paradigm shift around how we conceive of streets. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara, for your presentation. And now we will welcome Rob Stokes. Rob is an urbanist and recognized thought leader on sustainable urban development. In a political career spanning more than 15 years, he has served as Minister for Planning, Public Spaces, Cities, Infrastructure, Transport, Education, Environment, and Heritage, as well as Australia's first ever Minister for Active Transport with the New South Wales government. Rob is a regular columnist on cities and planning, and has written more than 20 articles in referred books and journals. A qualified lawyer, Rob has read Sustainable Urban Development at Oxford and completed a PhD in planning law under the Commonwealth Scholarship. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Jen. Can you hear me okay? Great. Thanks, everyone, for the opportunity to have a chat with you and explain some of the insights that I received from being part of the AGF contingent as part of the 20 Australians who were at Velo-City in Leipzig. And I wanted to take a slightly whimsical, or no, not whimsical is not the wrong word, more I guess more pedestrian, to excuse the pun, view of some of the issues that came out of Velo-City for me. Often when we think about cycling, we look at the wider environmental benefits, we look at some of the productivity benefits, we look at the social sustainability benefits. But something that spoke to me were the benefits for basic household budgets. It reminded me of a distinction that the ancient Greeks had between the polis, that was the responsibility of the citizen towards society, and the oikos, which was the citizen's own household and their responsibility to look after those nearest and dearest to them. And from polis, we get the words policy and politics, but from oikos, we get the words ecology and economics. So the issue that spoke to me at Velo-City in Leipzig were really more along those more household, pragmatic, practical issues. And of course, what's the big issue that our households are dealing with across Australia at the moment, it's the impacts of inflation, of rising prices for everything, impacts on mortgages, on rents, on building materials, on pretty much on fuel, on everything that we use in our daily lives. There was, maybe the next slide, please, Jen. Here is just a picture of the freeways of the city of Abuja. There was a great talk by one of the panelists who sits on the World Cycling Association or Federation with Sarah, and that's Emmanuel John. He comes from Abuja in Nigeria. And this is a photo of the freeway network of his hometown. As you can see, it is not bike friendly or accessible at all. Those freeways are vast. They're ironically actually fairly empty. So they could be retrofitted to make it convenient for cycling, but at the moment, it's certainly not a safe environment. He made the point that while that photo symbolises the aspirations of Nigeria's political elites for the country that they lead, the reality is better expressed by the next slide, which are the suburbs of Abuja where everyone lives. As you can see, there's not really convenient spaces for either cars or bicycles, but the entirety of the city and the imagery of the city, the monumental architecture of the city was deliberately designed to express the ambitions that Nigeria's government had for their country. Ironically, the city was designed by a firm of 4 white middle-aged American architects, the International Planning Associates, one of whom was Ian McHarg, who was a great urban designer in his own right. But nevertheless, it was sort of ironic and I think quite powerful, makes the point of how exclusionary that Abuja was set up to be, that it was actually designed by 4 white American architects with no experience of life in Nigeria. But the point that Emmanuel John raised was he lived in a city that was very car dependent, that was designed around the motor vehicle, but that more than 85% of the inhabitants of the city couldn't afford a motor vehicle. So as a result, that they were excluded from the opportunities to participate in society, in the economy. They couldn't be productive. They couldn't access the opportunities that were right at their fingertips because they couldn't pay for the vehicle that would facilitate access and which the entirety of that city had been planned around. I was sort of in smug middle-class Australian outrage saying, oh, well, you know, what a terrible third world country. But then I reflected and I thought, well, really, how different are the cities we're designing in terms of excluding the majority of the population from participating in the opportunities that the city provides? Next slide, please, Jen. The next slide here shows you the emerging new town of Edmondson Park in the outskirts of Sydney. It is meant to be a model of transit-oriented development. What you're seeing is a bird's eye view of the southwest rail line coming through Edmondson Park, burgeoning suburbs in the southwest of Sydney, the Macarthur region. And you'll see the land uses surrounding the train station. It's very flat, very cyclable terrain. But you'll see, it's a little bit hard to make out, but subsequent slides will make it clear that that there are a huge number of commuter car parks around this transit-oriented development. I've always thought that that is somewhat ironic, that transit-oriented development is not really all that transit-oriented, it's more car-oriented, but nevertheless, there you have it. It's difficult to see the close-up of that photo, but you'll also see that the streets surrounding the train station are themselves parked out by vehicles who weren't able to secure a spot in the commuter car parks. The next slide shows you the outlook from the station itself, looking over those acres and acres of commuter car parks. If this were a European city, you'd be looking out in a forest of bars, of restaurants, of bookshops, of retail outlets, of homes, of theatres. and a densely populated and alive community. In southwest Sydney, you're looking at acres of cars. The next slide demonstrates that government is moving some way to responding to those concerns by building at vast cost, about $30 million, a multi-storey car park to ensure that not only that those hundreds of millions of dollars of real estate, but also the hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cars inside them is housed in a $30 million multi-storey car park to make sure they're safe. So in one sense, at least we're learning to make a better use of the land than just at-grade commuter car parks. To be fair, Transport for New South Wales is also investing in bike infrastructure, parking infrastructure. So while there are commuter car parks providing for so far a total of more than 2,000 motor vehicles, the next slide indicates that significant expenditure has also been made on providing room for what seems to be 4 bicycles and one Razor scooter. So we're investing in cycle infrastructure too. The next slide goes to a cadastral map that shows 3 areas that have been identified for those commuter car parks. That expands to about 6 hectares of land. And the price for commercial real estate in Edmondson Park is running at about $300 a square metre. So you can do the maths at just how much public value is locked up in providing the apparatus for people to be able to drive their cars to access the railway station. So in one sense, well, that's okay, isn't it? I mean, we're not like Nigeria. It's not like 85% of the population can't afford a motor vehicle. Or is it? The next slide makes a point about, this is one more slide. This slide actually indicates that it is cycle friendly to get to the railway station from the north. You'll see there that green solid line is a separated cycleway, although on further investigation, I noted that cars were parked across the separated cycleway, but nevertheless it had been provided that goes to the rail station. The dotted line south of the rail station, that green line, is to provide what's called by Google a cycle-friendly route. The next slide indicates what that cycle-friendly route looks like. As you can see there, that single lane narrows down into, there is no verge to go through a busy roundabout right next to an emerging commercial area. So I would argue, I don't think that that's particularly cycle-friendly in any event. But having said all this, as I was saying before, well, it doesn't terribly much matter, does it? Because, of course, 85%, it's not as if 85% of the residents of Edmondson Park can't afford a motor vehicle. So if public money is spent on providing easier access for more people by more cars, is that necessarily such a problem? Well, the next slide indicates really that question as to whether it is that different in many ways to the access of the ordinary citizens of Abuja and the ordinary citizens of Edmondson Park. The average house price in Edmondson Park is just under $1.2 million. The median monthly household income there is a bit over $10,000 a month. The median monthly mortgage repayments at the last census were about $2,800 a month. So that's about quarter the average monthly household income. However, since the census data, the increase in average mortgage repayments in Edmondson Park has been more than $1,200, meaning that now for the average household, more than 40% of their household income is spent servicing a mortgage. The definition of housing stress is spending more than 30% of your income on housing related costs. So here the median income in Edmondson Park is spending more than 40% of their income on housing costs. And that is not counting those people who are coming off lower fixed term mortgage rates, for whom the average increase in mortgage repayments will be even steeper. Now, so people can't really afford to live in Edmondson Park and can't really afford to service the housing costs of living in this environment. As I mentioned, it's a relatively short, within 1 to 2 kilometre flat cycle from the surrounding suburbs to the train station, yet people aren't doing it because the infrastructure is not there. The average number of motor vehicles per dwelling, about 2 vehicles per dwelling. And when you look at those aerial photos, it's clear that the majority of a lot of those vehicles are being used as shuttles to get from the suburbs into the railway station to access employment and spend the majority of the day sitting in a car park, in a very expensive car park on very expensive real estate. And the average monthly cost of operating a motor vehicle is now around $1,313. It occurred to me that if people had the infrastructure to be able to replace that commuter vehicle with a commuter bicycle, and you could get a very nice commuter bicycle for less than the average monthly cost of operating a motor vehicle, that would more than compensate for the increase in mortgage repayments due to the recent inflationary pressures. So at a very simplistic, pragmatic household budget level, cycling can actually make our lives more sustainable. And it occurred to me that that statement by Emmanuel John in relation to his hometown of Abuja, that literally roads were excluding people from participating in society and in the economy and in actually getting ahead. Well, the very same observations could be made of the cities we're designing in New South Wales and also right across Australia. I should point out that in New South Wales, we've come some way since this place of Edmondson Park was designed about 10 years ago or so, but it shows that there is so far to come to ensure that people can actually access and afford the sorts of society that we want to build for ourselves. And rather than fill ourselves with inflated pride that we're a first world country and, well, Abuja is a capital of a third world country, in one sense, are we all that different? Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Rob, for that presentation and for taking us around the world. I will now introduce Robbie Napper. Dr. Robbie Napper is an industrial designer, researcher, and senior lecturer with the Department of Design at Monash University. He's also deputy director of the Mobility Design Lab. He has experience in the design and manufacture of public transport vehicles and led the design and development of Australia's most widely adopted route bus, the Vulcan Optimus. Robbie is an active member of the US National Academy of Science Transportation Research Board and in the fields of bus transit system and transit capacity and quality of service. Also an associate of Monash University's Public Transport Research Group. Please welcome Robbie.
Thanks, Jen, and hi everyone. I am assuming the audio works. I've called my presentation A Week in the Future, and don't worry, it's not all going to be in eye-bleeding bright yellow, but I wanted to start with a sort of the Velo-City experience, what it's actually like to be there. Spoiler alert, I'm going to suggest that everybody here goes next year, but I'd like to take you through some of the highlights on my experience and how, to me, it really felt like spending a week in the future. So next slide, please. Today, I'm going to touch on overarching themes, some of the sort of broad vibes that I got from Velo-City this year in Leipzig, and I'm also going to touch on some, not all, of the technical details. There are so many more that could be shared, but I won't go into too many of those. But I wanted to give you all a sense of the types of things that you could learn from going to a Velo. So I'm going to intermingle between these two things in my talk today. Next slide, please. And it was very kind of the conference themselves to publish this photo. I think that might be your right forearm in the image too there, Sarah. But at the end of day one, at the sort of welcome drinks in the conference centre, they snapped this photo. We didn't know. And it is all about these fellow citizens. So there's this very welcoming atmosphere. And I think I really couldn't emphasize this enough about the conference. It's a great mix, and it's a very egalitarian atmosphere and mixture of people. You've got a few academics like myself probably spoiling the show, but there's this great mix of policymakers, practitioners, people from all levels of government. And although it's an ECF conference, a European Cycling Federation conference, you do get people from all over the world. So the sort of the byline of it being the World Cycling Congress really is quite fitting, in my opinion. The other thing about being a Velo citizen is not only the ability to go to the sessions and all that learning, but it's actually the conference experience. And as Jen touched on in the introduction to today's session, there's all these other things that come with the conference as well. For me, one of the highlights this year was actually that the conference centre in this photograph was 8 kilometres out of town, out of the CBD, still within Leipzig. And so the conference organisers had to organise a bike path. And every day when I rode my bike up the bike path to attend the conference, I would actually end up chatting to somebody new. And thankfully their English was a lot better than my German or my Dutch. But to literally make new friends and to talk to people about what they're doing at Velo-City was so amazing. And to do that on 2 wheels really was sort of demonstrative of the whole attitude for the conference. So there's this loveliness that comes along with the conference that I think can't be understated as well. Next slide, please. So quotable quotes. I've got a notebook full of them. So I'm going to share some of the more choice ones, I suppose. So the first thing I want to talk about is the vibe, and look, speakers that are the real deal. So I think we all, are lucky enough sometimes to attend conferences from time to time. The caliber of the speakers at Velo was really, really high. Everybody had something to say. And so, of course, the notes sort of reflect that. Here we are, keynote number 1, just off the bat, Carlos Moreno speaking about the 15-minute city with this great quote, that cycling investment is such a low-hanging fruit that most transport planners can't see it out of their car windows. He really I think he really had us wrapped around his little finger at that point in the talk. The idea being that sometimes you can't see what you can't see, and that cycling investment doesn't actually have to be very expensive. We'll happily spend millions of dollars on an intersection to improve what some people might call traffic flow. But the amount of bike lane, the amount of bike infrastructure or bike parking you could produce for that money is quite profound. So Carlos had some really interesting things to say about that. The other quote that wouldn't even fit on the slide that I loved was that he sees schools as the capitals of 15-minute cities, which I thought was a really lovely way to think about how we might build transport and encourage different transport behaviours. Schools are a big thing, but not unlike other massive trip generators like hospitals. Next slide, please. Yeah, I couldn't help but put Rodney Ellis's great quote in here: leaders ought to lead. There was a fantastic discussion that permeated the whole conference. Plenaries 4 and 6 were highlights for me in this sense. In that the Velo-City conference is able to assemble a really great cross-section of leaders. And when I say great cross-section, I mean geographically diverse in their experiences, in their levels of government, from European Parliament to local government and everything in between, and also different experiences in their tenures as elected ministers and so forth. So, we've got this fantastic mixture on the screen here of commissioners and mayors and ministers with all these different levels of responsibility. The idea of leadership was really strong at the conference, and Rodney drew this fantastic distinction for me, which was that if you stand for Parliament, for government, for some level of elected office on a platform of doing something, then you really ought to get on and do it. And it just really cut through for me, because I think we do have some wonderful people elected in various offices in Australia who are elected on platforms of doing things. And I think what Rodney was getting at was that there can be a consultation fatigue. And he made a distinction between consulting on what you do and consulting on how you do it. And for him, it was, well, I'm elected on this platform. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. I'm going to lead. But I will consult on the manner in which it's done. And I thought that was a really useful distinction, because consultation done well is really great, but it's got to be on purpose. And so he distinguished between those purposes quite nicely, I thought. Next slide, please. So details, so many juicy details at Velo-City. Yes, bit of a transport nerd, that's me. And so, you know, being able to go to some of these sessions to really dig down into how things are done was one of the great pleasures. Probably my favorite was session 10.6. This was Friday morning, hot on the heels of the conference dinner the night before. So it was me and a couple of dozen dedicated bike parking people who were at this session with Lotte Reisman from Royal Haskening. And it was a great session. What Lotte really got to was that bike parking isn't just bike parking. The level of detail that Royal Haskening brought to the table with this project in Delft was to understand that different people ride different bicycles for different purposes on different times of day and in different parts of town. Something that we can all probably understand is true, but that we may not account for so well in our design of parking. And this is one of the core reasons why I called my talk today A Week in the Future, is because what Royal Haskening have done in this project is they've looked at the different uses that people have for bicycles, but they've also looked at the different bicycles people use for different purposes. So you've got your, you know, sort of family mothership e-cargo bike. Well, that's got to be parked in a particular way versus your station seats, your trashmobile sort of bike that's worth less than 50 euros that you leave at the station all day. It has a different type of parking. The paint's all chipped, it barely works, you know. Differentiating between these different types of bikes and the different types of parking that they require is a highly granular, really detailed activity, and it's really expressed in this matrix here. And there's Lotte just in the picture there explaining the different types of bikes, the different types of riders. It's the facilitation of real bike riding for transport purposes that I think was done really well here. So what I sort of take great comfort from in this slide and with this activity session 10.6 was that level of understanding that we're only beginning to see a requirement for in some places in Australia has already been worked out by somebody else. Royal Haskening participate in the Dutch Cycling Embassy, so all their knowledge is really accessible. And this is just one example of the type of detail that they're already across. I think that's very reassuring. You know, I know it's not copy-paste for Australia, but it's nice to know that there's a real sound knowledge basis on which we can build our cycling transport system. Next slide, please. But Europe isn't perfect. So this was reassuring too, because just when I was getting sort of a bit kind of starry-eyed with all this stuff, we also got to talk about the problems. So Annika's talk from the VCD was really good. This is about the German problem, that there's a generation of children in Germany who are growing up in the backseat of cars, who are lacking fundamental motor skills. They're lacking sort of geographic knowledge of their neighborhoods. They don't actually know the way to get to school, because for them they sit in the back of the car and then they magically arrive there. And I thought, oh, thank goodness they've got some problems that they're working through, because there's a real cultural symmetry there with Australia. We've got a similar problem in some parts of Australia. And so looking at the ways in which they're working through it, there's no surprises. They're looking at building good bike parking at schools, having safe ways to get there, all of these wonderful things. Making that transition in this context from in Berlin is a really similar story that could be told in many parts of Australian cities as well. So it was nice. You know, it wasn't all just Europe is great and you need to learn from us. It was sort of Europe has problems too. Let's talk about those, which is very refreshing, I think. So that was session 6.3. Next slide, please. This was interesting. So you may have heard of the Eurovelo routes. If you haven't, it's this vast Europe-wide network of recreational cycling routes. And they're immense in their length, as you can see from the map, 93,000 kilometers when fully realized. It's not fully realized yet. So I went to the session on the Eurovelo routes because I'm interested in all forms of how bicycles are used, and bicycles can be used recreationally, as we probably all know. The Eurovelo routes, the usage of these routes has gone up markedly in the last few years. And that, that's quite an interesting sort of story. So cycle tourism has gone up, which is kind of nice. And these routes are framed as tourism infrastructure. That's what they're built for. They're picturesque. They go through great cities and great locations. They go to UNESCO World Heritage Sites, you name it, they do it. But here's what I wasn't expecting, is that there's a really great synergy between the tourism effort and just the basic transport component of cycling, the sort of transport cycling that's going to help homes pay their mortgage that Rob just spoke about. And the thing is that when you build a high quality tourism route, it's going to go through a city. It's going to go through places where people live and work and go to school. So what's happened is that the use of these Eurovelo routes has gone up because tourism's gone up, but it's gone up even more because they're just high quality cycling routes and they're through big cities. So lots of people live on them or live close to them. So there's this fantastic sort of payback where you might invest in a Eurovelo route with tourism budget, but actually you're also making your transport work better. And so they've identified, Eurovelo have identified that there's this great synergy, and so they're able to kickstart or accelerate the building of these routes, because they're saying to their cities, well, let's invest with some money from tourism and some money from the transport portfolio, put it together for a high quality cycling route. So I think that's really nice, because it's just good cycling is good cycling. Safe is safe, those kind of themes, whether you're a tourist or whether you're a school child, it's the ability to get on your bike and head somewhere. That's really nice. I tested this out as well on the weekend after the conference. It was very hard work, as you can imagine. Next slide, please. Another one on the details. One thing that struck me that was really healthy at Velo was that good enough isn't good enough. It's always striving for better. So a little bit to Sarah's point of demanding the impossible. This is Berlin, and this fantastic talk from Maria on what's happening in Berlin. It's next generation. So they've got this situation where there's these three massive key intersections in Berlin. They've had really big changes in the last decade for making them more cycle friendly. And I'm talking here about sort of, space allocation, like in the photograph, but they're talking about what comes next. So in this photo, if you look closely, you can see that there's a right turn slip lane. What for us in Australia would be a left turn. It's been completely closed off. They've said, well, we're now at the level of cycling where we need to allocate more space to bicycle vehicles. And so we're going to take away this slip lane, and we're going to make this intersection safer. So we're getting rid of an entire kind of conflict point here to go next generation on this stuff. So this was session 9.3. It was just amazing to get these specific examples. So if you wanted to have a look at what those details mean and sort of where you go from what we would aspire to in Australia, what's the next possible step? When you're at a Berlin kind of level, what do you do next? That evidence is right there for us to look at, which is so nice. Next slide, please. There's some useful links that will be shared in the chat as well. All the slides are actually available in a publicly linked Google folder. So if you'd like to dive into any of the sessions, you can, which is amazing. All that detail that I've provided today, but every single session, they're all up there as PDFs. So I say hats off to the ECF for making that very, very accessible in the public domain. I think that's wonderful. It is a little bit tricky to find if you're Googling around for it. So that's why I thought I'd provide the link directly. I'd encourage anyone to look at the ECF website if ever any of you are in a position where you're talking about the value of cycling. The ECF have excellent resources to help you win those arguments. For example, looking at the UN SDGs and how cycling can deliver on those. Next slide. And just to finish where I started off, I'm not going to play this video, of course, but see you in Ghent, of course, next year, in the 18th to the 21st of June. Winning a Velo-City, hosting a Velo-City conference is a little bit like winning the Olympics. So Ghent are very excited to be hosting next year. They've produced this humorous video to entice us all to come. I'll provide that in the links as well. And thank you very much for having me, Jay. Back to you.
Thank you, Robbie, for that presentation. And I was there in Velo-City, but believe it or not, I've been taking notes today as well, because our excellent presenters, I feel, not only are sharing the best highlights of their conference, but also taking it a step forward. And okay, what does this mean? What have I, with my experience and the current local challenges, have I thought after learning all of this? And in the interest of time, we will be collecting all your questions in the chat. So please feel free to share them there. I just shared the 2 links that Robbie mentioned. The Velo-City 2023 presentations, as well as the Ghent Velo-City 2024 promotional video. Please check that, get inspired, and hopefully start planning a trip to Velo-City 2024. If you follow this QR code, it would also take you to their website. Now, a little bit about AGF key takeaways. For us, seeing that there is so much interest in open data and better sources of data, or better infrastructure, was something that highlighted and really helped us feel that we are in the right path, or by asking for better and open data sources. Because the truth is, bike lanes are not just pavement, are not just transport, but they are what help us understand what our cities and regions are going through, and how can we as practitioners, but also policymakers, can do to make better decisions. But the truth is also that this only happens if we have people who have excellent skills and have been able to get access to excellent training. That is something that will take us from seeing the bicycle just as the bicycle, to seeing the bicycle beyond cycling, seeing it as a great strategy to stay healthy, a way to get to school, a way for kids to develop more independence in the crucial years during their childhood. And all of this is something that at AGF we have been thinking about and working for. And now Stuart from the AGF team will share with us the Safe Roads for Safe Cycling program.
Thanks, Jen. I'm just going to start with a big thank you to not just our presenters, but to everyone for dialing in during your lunch break on a Friday. We've got a lot of people from Perth here as well. So mid-morning, thank you so much. A special shout out to a few people on our board who are here. Just shows their appetite to learn, which is so valuable for us, people working in the sector, to have your support and interest. And a special shout out to Mary Safe, who's here. Mary is Amy Gillett's mum, and I'm going to say the strongest advocate I've ever met. So thank you, Mary. We were in Leipzig because it is the world's best sort of cycling cities conference. It's also where Amy died. The crash that killed Amy took place just outside of Leipzig, changed the lives of all of the people involved in the crash, and an incredibly emotional time for us. So the reason for us going is not just to learn, best practice from all the things we've just heard, but just to understand that connection to the local area as well. So worth mentioning. We've just heard here a lot, and I just want to close this out by saying how kind of validating Velo-City was for AGF's current focus. So our current focus is this program, which is funded by the federal government. We are really leaning into capability building, skills and data to improve cycling across Australia. So we heard little bits there about lessons from Africa, from Texas. The Europeans hit us with every piece of information we could have hoped for. And a lot of it boiled down to the importance of training people in best practice design. It's the exact focus of this program. A huge focus on leadership. Leading the transition was the title of the conference. And we're trying to do that. We're trying to get leaders to lead. So a big part of our program will be councillor facing or mayor facing content to take their knowledge of safe cycling or cycling cities up a few notches. We would love every state to have a minister for active transport. That would be just a wonderful thing. I remember really distinctly someone from Copenhagen talking about a role within that public sector that is cycling superhighways partnerships coordinator. What an incredible title to exist in a public agency. So we've got a long way to go, but for us, being a year into this program and really getting towards the pointy ends of many of the programs we're delivering, very validating, very comforting to know that we're, as Jen said, sort of kicking in the right direction. We've got a very strong breeze at our back. And around the edges of this conference, we were lucky enough to meet with Chris Boardman from Active Travel England. They have a £2 billion investment to spend. This is from national government in the UK in active transport. The day that we were in Paris, we heard about the press release came out in the morning of a really important meeting we had, which detailed over €2 billion investment from the national government in cycling. The Dutch government are trying to upskill 10,000 practitioners across the world in cycleway design. I could keep going, but just to give you an idea of the level of leadership that's happening and how far we have to go in Australia was really not deflating. You could take it as being deflating, but it wasn't. It was really uplifting to see how much we can do. So I just wanted to kind of leave that with you. We would love to talk more with the many people on this call that are interested in the program and the little ticks that you can see on this slide. You'll hear a lot more from us over the next weeks, months, but don't be shy. Hit us up with any questions. We would love to field them. And yeah, just again, thank you for dialing in and hearing from these great Australian leaders. It's wonderful. I'll give back to you, Jen.
Thank you, Stu, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Robbie also shared the links. Apologies if the first time I shared them, they were not working. But please feel free to, as Stu said, reach out, connect through social media, through our LinkedIn profiles, send us an email. I saw a couple of incredible comments in the chat, and being from Bogota, I cannot lie that I got a little bit excited. And once again, if it is possible, start thinking about going to Ghent. You will not be disappointed. Thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your Friday and have a great weekend.